Good afternoon. How are we all?
Very good. Terrific.
Good. Having a good conference? So this is a little talk about, I suppose, indirectly, how we all came to be here. A certain amount of juggling is required as I move between the microphone and the computer. I think we'll have to try and make sure we get a longer lead next year, or speakers with longer arms, one and the other, I don't know which. Okay, so I've been involved in computing for a long time. 67, 68 I think was when I started, and I trained as a computational scientist. But I came into computing from electronics originally, and I still do some hobby electronics, so at the moment I mess around with MicroPython as well as using Python in my day job as CTO at Global Stress Index. And something that I've always been involved with is user groups of one kind and another. So in 1975, I was treasurer of the Deacon's UK group. I moved to the States, as you'll find out during the talk, in about 95 it was. But PyCon came out of Python, of course. And Python, as you may know, was actually started over the 1989 Christmas holidays by Guido van Rossum. And at the time he was employed by an organisation called CWI, which is an institute that was part of the Mathematische Centrum in Amsterdam. So in 1994, Python was popular enough that they could run the first international Python conference, and there were a number of interesting talks. You can actually still find some of these talks on the internet, but one of the things that's been brought home to me during the research for this talk is that a lot of this material is actually quite ephemeral, and so it's very difficult to find anything about Python. Certainly find pictures about Python and Python personalities until about 2000, something like that. So there was a series of international Python conferences starting in November 1994. And they had one or two a year. Most years had two, and some of them only had one. And as you can see, there's a complete gap in 1999, typical of the way that geeks organise things, I suppose. And the 2002 event is highlighted for reasons which will become clear. So, in 1995, that was the best picture I could find of Guido in 1995. Sorry about the poor resolution, it's obviously been given. This was probably a tiny little image to start with. But in 1995, Guido moved to Western Virginia to work for a company called the Corporation for National Research Initiatives, where he was actually funded to work primarily on the Python language, although he did do a number of other things. Now, there were a number of key contributors back in those days. This is a guy called Barry Warsaw, whose name you may not know, but you've almost certainly used a piece of software that he wrote, because he's the author of Mailman, which is a new project that is used, it's estimated, by about a third of the mailing lists in the world nowadays. So Barry was a Python enthusiast from very early on and made a lot of contributions to the language. And so I thought it would be nice to show you a few pictures of him, because nobody really likes just boring text lines. There was also a character called Jeremy Hilton, and it turned out I couldn't really find any pictures at all of Jeremy in that era, but I did manage to find one of a young Jeremy Hilton. There's also another core contributor called Tim Peters, and if you enjoy using the dict then Tim is one of the guys who, as he put it, optimized the snot out of dictionaries to make them work as a practical container. Not only that, Tim is also the author of the Zen of Python. You all heard of the Zen of Python? If you haven't, all you need to do is type import this into your interpreter and you'll get it. And Tim is also, he's the only person I know who's had a sort routine named after him. So he wrote this Tim sort algorithm that's used by Python for sorting. And then there was a character called Fred Drake, and I can't show you an early picture of Fred because there's only about one picture of him on the internet, and I'm saving that for later. So, in 1995, at the same time approximately that Guido moved to work in Reston, Virginia, I also went to work in Reston, Virginia. Now, at that time, I'd been interested in object-oriented programming for about 20 years, because back in my early career as an undergraduate in 1973, I'd found some of the papers from Alan Kay's group at Palo Alto Research Center talking about the Smalltalk language. And at one point in my career, in the 1980s, I was an academic, and I got a research student to implement the Smalltalk virtual machine on a VAX 11750. It wasn't a terribly powerful machine, but it meant that I could get to play with Smalltalk. And I discovered that it wasn't actually that interesting a language to me. It was, I suppose, as a Pythonista, you will understand if I say it just didn't fit my brain. It didn't seem to be a natural way to express object-oriented languages. So, I was waiting for a restaurant place, and it was one of those places in the States where they give you a pager, and they said, well, there'll be a 45-minute wait for a table, but if you want, you can walk around the hall. The pagers work in the bookshop upstairs. So I went to the bookshop upstairs, and I came across this book called Learning Python by Mark Lutz and David Asher. And I absorbed learning Python over 2 or 3 days, and I thought, wow, this is an amazing language for expressing object-oriented algorithms in. So within a week, I joined the conf.lang.python mailing news group, which is just a news group reflection of the Python mailing list. And I started to ask questions and answer them. So one of the interesting things about PyCon, as with so many other things good things that happen in the world, is that it kind of relied on serendipity, the art of happy chance discovery. So when I moved to the States, I knew nothing at all about Python. I'd heard the name, but I'd never used it. So I'd moved 3,500 miles from the UK. Guido had moved 3,500 miles from Amsterdam, and we now lived within 15 miles of each other. Now, this wasn't a deliberate strategy, and indeed, I didn't really understand what a centre of high Pythonicity Reston, Virginia had become. So the language continued to develop, and the IPCs continued, and in May 2000, Guido moved from CNRI to a company called Be Open, which you may or may not remember. They were an operating systems company who were hoping to take the world by storm. So they started a group called Python Labs, which was made up of Guido van Rossum, Barry Warsaw, Fred Drake, Tim Peters, and Jeremy Hilton, the people whose pictures that I've showed you. And this is a picture of the Python Labs team outside their offices. I presume that Barry Warsaw must have taken the picture, because the guy on the right is actually Caping Yi. That's not Barry Warsaw, so that must have been an occasion of Caping Yi's visit. So, with the formation of Python Labs in McLean, Virginia, about 15 miles down the road from me, the scene was set. Now, in 2000, I had planned to go to the International Python Conference, which was I think it was in DC that year, but a combination of server faults and a snowstorm meant that I didn't actually get to go to the IPC until 2002, which was why it was highlighted on the original slide. And in fact, this picture is a picture of the people at IPC 10 who had all been, those are all the people who'd been at the very first IPC back in 1994. So when I got to IPC 10, I discovered that it was run by a company called Fortec, and Fortec were a partner with CNRI, but their primary revenue earner was organising meetings for the IETF, the Internet Engineering Task Force. And so they were pretty much the very antithesis of community conferences. They were commercial events run in hotels, attended by people typically from large corporations who had plenty of money and expense accounts. And similarly, the international Python conferences were run in hotels. So I found myself in this very large hotel. I was lucky I didn't have to stay at the hotel because I lived within 12 miles, so I could drive in every day. But basically, because Fortec were used to running commercial events at hotels, the result was that the events were expensive and they were sort of somewhat detached from the community. I remember thinking as I registered, the people who I was talking to over the registration desk showed absolutely no curiosity about me or any of the other people at the event. And they would spend their time, with arms folded, talking to each other most of the time when the event was going on. But the significant feature of IPC 10 for me was the formation of the Conferences Discuss mailing list, which Guido said he wanted to start to discuss how we might develop Python conferences. So Conferences Discuss was opened at the IPC in February 2002. And it's interesting how your memory plays tricks on you, because in my imagination, until I actually did the research and found this initial message, I had imagined that I'd waited several months for information to appear on this website. But in actual fact, I posted on the 13th of February, which is about a week after the conference. So I was clearly quite anxious to try to get something going. And so I wrote this 673-word email, which basically made a number of points, which I could summarize by saying that, first of all, Fortec, the organizers, weren't really in touch with the Python community, and that they weren't marketing to it. I asked everybody, who had seen any marketing literature anywhere for PyCon, or rather for the IPC, and sure enough, nobody had. Not only that, but I felt that the IPC events excluded many community members that I knew from comp.lang.python, mostly on cost grounds. There were a bunch of young kids, a lot of them, they couldn't really afford to be spending $12, $15 or $1,800 to fly to a conference, book hotel accommodation, and so on. And the final point I made was that with my own experience in organising conferences in the UK, the Deacon's conferences, for example, I felt that the community could do a better job for itself. But the closing words were portentous. I shudder when I remember how difficult it is to actually organise a professional conference. And I'm sure that as you look at everything that's taking place around you this week, you'll realise that there is a huge amount of effort that goes into making these things work smoothly. Now, as another piece of serendipity, In 2002, just before IPC 10, my book Python Web Programming was published. In there I was trying to basically relate all the technologies that you needed to build websites. So we discussed the TCP/IP stack, database technologies, and I actually wrote web servers in pure Python that, while they weren't exactly, they're certainly not going to compete against any of today's modern technology, but they clearly demonstrated Python's utility on the web. So at IPC 10, Guido and I met for the first time, and because I was now a published Python author, they weren't very common in those days, that gave me a certain credibility. And we fell to talking, and I discovered that the Python Labs offices were only 12 miles down the road. So every couple of weeks I would go to lunch with the Python Labs team, because it was always interesting to find out more about the internal details of Python. And we started talking about this email that I sent. And after a few discussions lasting about 2 or 3 months, Guido said the PSF would actually underwrite a community organised conference if I would agree to chair it. And that was a pretty daunting prospect, but I wanted this to happen. I really didn't want people to have the same experience I had, where you turn up at a commercial venue and you get a disinterested organiser. And so we started looking for a venue. And again, an interesting piece of serendipity. At the time, Guido was going to improv dance classes in Washington, D.C. at a room in the George Washington University. And so he said to me, well, look, go and talk to the conference people at GWU, and maybe they will have a space that we can use. And sure enough, they did. And so in March of 2003, we went to the Marvin Center at George Washington University, and there were 250 people at that first conference. Now, of course, in those days, there was no Slack, there was basically just internet use groups and internet relay chat. So we put information out about the conference on comp.lang.python and Python Announce. We got an amazing amount of help from the Yet Another Perl conference team, and the conference was born. Now, we did have a loose form of organisation. This is one of the few remaining organisational documents that you can find on the Python wiki that lists some of the tasks that needed to be doing. At the end of the week, I discovered that we made a profit of $17,000. And I mean, when you look at PyCon's budget in the States now, I think it's about $3.5, $4 million a year, something like that. So the sums involved were joke-worthily small. But we did anyway end up making some money. And at the end of the conference, the PSF, which was newly formed, had a meeting, and Guido proposed that I should be elected to the PSF. So I became a PSF member, and I chaired the next 2 conferences. And in 2004, I said, I'm only going to do one more, so you'll need to find somebody else to organise these things. In 2004, I met a guy called John Pinna, who had come over from the States. And if you know anything about PyCon UK's history, you'll know that John started it. And in 2005, he actually came over again with his wife, and we had a week's holiday afterwards and started to lay plans to do a similar thing in the UK. But we had 450 people in 2005. It was the first time we were split over multiple floors, and it became apparent that we'd actually outgrown our venue. So in 2006, we moved to Dallas in Texas, and the Dallas conferences were chaired by Andrew Kuchling on the left there and Jeff Rush on the right. It was the first time in a hotel venue, and in 2006, we completely swamped the hotel's Wi-Fi network, and upstream internet links. And so in 2007, that was the first time that we actually organized our own networking. We actually hired, I think it was a microwave link to an internet service provider. We put our own infrastructure in, and this is a diagram that Sean Riefschneider, the guy who did the organization, created with the number of people attached or to each of the different access points. So we learned our lesson on networking, and we continued to use our own infrastructure until about 2013, when it became apparent that the venues had caught up. So in 2008, we moved to Chicago because the PSF had taken bids from community groups. We were out near the airport, and the problem with that was they were a long way from the city. It was also the first conference where the absence of gender diversity became apparent. We were downstairs in the basement, and there was such a long queue for the lavatories that a decision was taken to repurpose the ladies' toilets as a gents. Now, still remember to this day Anna Ravenscroft's indignant declaration that she wasn't going upstairs to pee for anybody, and so they were now unisex toilets, and she'd be damned if she was going to go upstairs when there was a perfectly good toilet down there. It was also the first time that we'd actually had a professional conference planner. In 2010, we moved to Atlanta, where Van Lindbergh chaired the conference, and in 2012, we moved to Santa Clara. Unfortunately, in 2013, there was an event you may even have heard about, Donglegate, where PyCon came to the world's attention because there was a gender issue, and a couple of people got fired as a result. 2013 is a huge conference venue in Santa Clara. That was the first time that we had to use convention centers. Happily, there were no repercussions from Donglegate, and so in 2014 we moved to Montreal, Canada. So that was the first time PyCon North America had been outside the USA. It was the first time that we had a woman as chair. And it was also the last time I went to PyCon US in 2015, because ironically, although I'd been living in Portland, Oregon until 2015, I left for the UK, and so I didn't get to attend the 2016 and 2017 conferences. Now, of course, it wasn't only America where things were happening. And if you look now, you'll see that there are PyCons all over the world, from Brazil to South Korea, the United Kingdom, obviously, Venezuela, Germany, all across Europe, Iran, Japan, Malaysia, and so on. Now, something you may not know is which was the first Python community conference. Anyone know the answer to that question? Interesting. Well, in, I think it was June 2002, in Charleroi, Belgium, EuroPython was one, and that also was a community conference. And I like to underline the fact that PyCon wasn't necessarily first, because somebody did actually take the time to organise one in Europe before that. And EuroPython still runs to this day, and it's still a very popular conference. Just to keep you in touch with where people are now, this is Barry Warsaw. I found a relatively recent picture of Fred Drake. That's Jeremy Hilton, he still works for Google. Couldn't find a recent picture of Tim. And of course that's Guido van Rossum in, I think that was 2015, something like that. So when you look at the way PyCon's grown from 250 attendees in 2003, they had over 3,300 people in Portland last week. Those figures are only for North America, so I've no idea what the number is worldwide. But certainly it has seen amazing growth. And my conclusions from the history were a lot of accidental circumstances led to this. If I hadn't moved close to Guido and started to use Python, then PyCon, it would have happened, but it would have been something entirely different. The The other thing is, it taught me that empowered community members are a force to be reckoned with. I got so much help from people on the early events, and I found organising an event brings people together as well. Do remember, by the way, that for organisers, the event goes by at 125 miles an hour. You very rarely got more than 2 hours sleep a night while I was organising PyCon. And of course, it also shows that from little acorns, mighty oak trees can grow. And we've got this huge worldwide set of events which all started out because two people happened to end up living near to each other in the early days. Okay, probably take a bit too long to handle any questions as it's now past my time, but I will be putting the slides up, and if you want to talk about it, I'll be happy to do so when I've left the podium. Thank you.
Okay, so just a very